Hi, David. You're muted. David, you're muted. Yeah.
There we go. Hi. Okay. Good evening to you. I guess good morning to me.
Hi, good morning to you. Exactly.
I just need a minute to sort of get my screen up and everything.
Yeah, for sure. We're just letting people in. People are just coming in. There you go. I just gave you share screen.
Good evening.
Hi, Elio. Hi, Miriam.
Yes, I think there was a problem with the time. I thought it was 8 o'clock, 8:30.
Yeah, for some odd reason, the wrong email went out. I sent on the WhatsApp group the right one. I think Dina forgot to change it.
Okay, because maybe some people, I came in at 8 and
I was
because we are in another meeting.
I know.
And maybe some
I was in the middle of giving
up.
Daf Yomi, and we had it scheduled 7:30 to 8:30. We swapped it around because of the shiur. So
Okay,
I think it was a mix-up.
Yeah, I'm just worried that some people may have given up. And
I'm also worried. But look, at least it's recorded. It'll go on YouTube tomorrow with Hashem, so if people can make it, at least we have the opportunity to have it recorded.
Okay, I'm here, so
Well, that's amazing.
I will learn.
Okay, just let me know whenever I have the green light.
We're just going to wait another minute. People
Okay.
come in. It's late, so we will start. Just literally another minute for people to come in.
Just have to have some of my morning coffee. I know you guys are.
I was going to say, first of all, okay, so I think we're going to start already because it's getting late and it's very early for you. So first of all, welcome everyone to our third episode in episodes of Sephardic history. Today we've got a bit of a different angle. We would like to say a special thank you to Chacham David, as we would call you, Rabbi David Brovsky from Israel, who has woken up early, especially to give us this class. It's 6:30 in the morning, I believe, by you.
6:30, yeah.
So really, Sirut Nefesh, kol hakavod to you. So we really appreciate that. David, Richard, I'm just going to ask you to give a short, brief introduction to David's background, and without any further ado, we'll ask you to go ahead. So, Richard, Chavot.
So if you haven't heard of Rabbi David Brovsky, you really should have, because he has written a couple of tremendous books on a Hilchos of the festivals and also Hilchos Avelis. He's a great speaker, and put it over to Rabbi Brovsky.
Thank you.
Okay, it's great to be here. Can I share the screen?
Yes, you should be able to.
Okay, so I'll just introduce and then I'll put up sort of like a source sheet. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. The wonders of time zones. Now I understand you're doing a series on, I guess, Sephardic history or Sephardic rabbis, which I think is fascinating. And I'll be honest, I myself in recent years have delved deeper into, some of the, I don't want to say lesser known, but maybe lesser, that we were aware of the depth of their writings of some of the Sephardic figures. I think, over the past, 30, 40, 50 years, we've all been aware of giants like Rav Ovadia Yosef and others. But God willing, I hope you also have shiurim on people like Rav Masas and other, towering figures over the past century that, were maybe a little bit eclipsed by Rav Ovadia Yosef, but, are also worth understanding and learning about. But today we're going to talk about Rav Ovadia Yosef. I'm going to share quickly a screen. Just tell me, did that go up? You see the picture there?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So, I was as I was thinking about what to say and preparing a bit, so I recalled that the rabbi of Alon Shvud of our yeshuv in Israel, after Ovadia Yosef passed away, so he wrote. I wouldn't call it a hesped because it's like 20, it's like, I don't know, 60, 80 pages long. But I had a copy in my file, so I skimmed over a little bit. And he recalls how when he was in high school, that, one of the first things that like was accessible to him in halachic literature was reading the writings of Rav Ovadia Yosef. And he would read through the Teshuvot, the Responsa of Yechavedat, which were very, very accessible. And he described it his first sort of like entrance into that world of halacha. And it very much resonated with me because I have to be honest, the same is really true for me. Meaning during my high school years, thank God I, began to be more and more into studying Torah. And I remember, wandering around the Beit Midrash and like the school library, and the Sfarim of Rav Ovadia Yosef, certainly of Yechavedat, we'll talk about it maybe in a second, was one of the most accessible. And it was just, it was a pleasure to read in terms of its clarity and its scope. And that's just a small example of, his influence, just by writing on little people, but let alone on a country. So let me quickly begin by giving a little bit of a biography of Rav Ovadia Yosef. I want to make sure I know how to, okay, here we go. So Rav Ovadia Yosef, just a little bit of biography, he was born in Baghdad in 1920. He moved with his family to Jerusalem in 1924. The story goes, there are a number of very interesting biographies that have been written over the past few years. What's interesting, by the way, is that when people write biographies about someone when they're still living, then you're dealing with a very special person. So even before Ovadia Yosef was niftar, already there were, here I have, here was a doctorate, somebody wrote about him, and here we got, let's say 2 more books, and these were all written, I believe, even when Ovadia Yosef was still alive. So you're dealing with a very special person. And they describe how, he lived in Yerushalayim. He actually came from a family that was very simple and not like a rabbinic family. And that may be very important in terms of his rabbinic development, but he came from a very poor, simple family without, rabbinic ancestry. And he was discovered very early as a sort of like prodigy. And the rabbis of Yeshivat Porat Yosef really said to his parents, that's it. He can't work for you anymore. He can't be the one to earn money for the family. He has to come to yeshiva. And he came to the yeshiva, and he was ordained in 1940 in Yeshivat Porat Yosef. And in 1947, he moves to Egypt. Basically, he's sent to Egypt to be the Av Beitin and the chief rabbi, I guess one could say, of Egypt and Cairo. But that didn't work out so well. We'll talk about that also very briefly. And he returned very quickly afterwards. He resigned very quickly. It was a very unhappy chapter in his life. Although the biographers claim that on a personal level, he actually enjoyed Egypt and the culture, but it was not very successful from a rabbinic point of view. He returned to Israel basically right after the state of Israel, after the War of Independence, after all that's over, in 1949, and he's appointed as a dayan, as a rabbinic judge in Petach Tikva. Already there, which is also part of his biography, he was a minority among other Ashkenazic judges, which caused him great frustration in terms of how they related to halacha and the sort of dominance of Ashkenazic, rulings. And anyway, in 1968, he was appointed the chief Sephardic rabbi of Tel Aviv. We know that in Israel, most cities have 2 rabbis, an Ashkenazic rabbi and a Sephardic rabbi, as well as the country itself. And therefore, in 1973, he was appointed the Rishon LeZion, meaning the chief Sephardic rabbi of the state of Israel. I'll just mention as an aside that one of the things he's most well known for during this time period was permitting the agunot after the Yom Kippur War, which is really a very powerful parasha in the history of the state of Israel. All the pilots that were lost during the war and their wives, and he was really entrusted with the task of what they call heter agunot. He founded the Shas political party in 1984. I don't want to get into the whole political side of it. I really tried to, focus on the more rabbinic side. And he passed away in 2013. In terms of his books, I listed here only a couple of them. To be honest with you, if I were to move my camera maybe up to the shelf over there, you'd see shelves and shelves of Sfarim of Rav Ovadia Yosef. but just in terms of some of his primary Sfarim, Halichot Olam, actually he published a little bit later in life, which is sort of like a commentary / critique of the Ben Ish Chai, which we'll talk about. Yabia Omer are really his large, in-depth Shelotu Teshuvot. Yechavedat are sort of a shorter Teshuvot. I believe a lot of them were based on a radio show he had in his early years on Fridays, and people would ask him questions, and he was phenomenal. And he would just answer them, and they wrote up the Teshuvot. He also had a set of books called Chazon Ovadia. We know that his children are very prolific. For example, his son, who's the current chief rabbi of Israel, Rav Yitzchak Yosef, has written a set called the Yalkut Yitzchak, which is Yalkut Yosef, which is really based upon his father's teachings. Okay, so that's in terms of biography, but our goal is to talk more about his Torah. So I know the title of the shir was a controversial rulings or something like that. So I don't know. I try not to label rabbis by their controversies. So I'm going to try to sort of highlight certain, I guess, what we call kavim, like lines of his halachic methodology, and give a few examples so we get a taste of who he was. But maybe we'll give a taste of the controversy in any case. One of the early controversies that he was in, remember he went to Egypt. I'm afraid to move my screen already, but what was it how old was he when he went to Egypt? Anybody remember? It was 1947, so he was 27. He was very young, and he had difficulty right away with the community there. And one of the issues that he had difficulty was, first of all, you should know in general, rabbis always have difficulty with kashrut, and especially shchita. And just to give you an example, like in America, meaning Rav Soloveitchik was tortured by the kashrut industry in Boston. He was almost indicted, you know what I'm saying, because the kashrut industry went after him because he stood up to them. And this is a common theme for rabbis. And Rav Ovadia Yosef was no exception, and he got into fights with the shochtim in Egypt. And he had other issues that he clashed with them. But one interesting issue had to do with the immersion of converts. And I want to quickly focus on that issue. I think it's actually very fascinating, maybe because on a personal level, I'm deeply involved in conversion, but in general, I think it's a very interesting issue. In general, one could say that conversion, the way the community related to conversion in the Sephardic world was much different than in the Ashkenazic world. Certainly in the Eastern European world, there was a lot of pushback against conversion, and very much an attitude of, oh, you're intermarried, so like, just leave, you know what I'm saying? I'm not saying there wasn't conversion, but, it became a very strict subject. And in different areas of the Sephardic world, for various reasons, they're actually very lenient, and they had a much more accepting approach to conversion. And their attitude was, if we embrace the couple and bring them into the community, then that's a better strategy. And Egypt was no exception. However, one of the more sensitive issues in conversion is the issue of the immersion of women in the mikvah, because we know what is the process of conversion aside from study and what we call kabbalat mitzvot. We have, for a man, we have brit milah, and for both a man and a woman, we have tevilah, we have immersing them in the mikvah, and they makabel mitzvot, they accept upon themselves the mitzvot in the mikvah. And of course, one of the first things that people think about, when they hear that that's true, is, hold on a second, it's already uncomfortable for a man to immerse in a mikvah in front of a beit din, but a woman, how exactly does that work? There was a debate that raged basically during the same time period, I could say in the first half of the 20th century in different areas in the world, how to deal with this issue. And just to give you an example from another fascinating chief rabbi that I hope that at some point someone gives a shir on, is Rav Uziel. And Rav Uziel was asked about this issue when he was also a rabbi in Chutz La'aretz in Saloniki. And I'll just read a little bit about how he dealt with it. And it says, Bioti misharet bakodesh, bi'ir right Saloniki, nishalti mefshar lachshir tvilat giyoret shelo b'mamad beit din. What was going on? They didn't always have sort of very simple mikvahot like we have nowadays, where every Beit Knesset has a mikvah, but rather they had these like springs, right? and they were merchatzaot, and the Jews were there, the non-Jews were there. And I guess when women would be tovel, they would go in there with another Jewish woman, and they would bathe, like every other woman that was there. But what was the problem? It's certainly inappropriate, if not illegal, for three rabbis who accompany a woman into the female bathing area, and that she should go into the mikvah, and they should watch her immerse. So he said, "Mikvat tahara nimsa b'merchatzaot shelo Yehudim, ubo mitrachatzot tamid gam nashim lo Yehudiyot." He said the mikvah that was being used in the area was in the non-Jewish bathing area. Vizeluta gedola. I mean, this is highly inappropriate, both for the Beit Din and davar zar le'inei ro'im, also for people looking. You know what I'm saying? How is this possible? The rabbis are going into the bathhouse and watching a woman immerse. So this was a major question. I should just note it wasn't just dealt with by Rav Uziel. Well, you know what? Let me first deal with his solution. So he describes at length here how inappropriate it is, and how Chazal were actually very sensitive in the way that the rabbis describe the immersion of the woman. Is that basically here he writes here that the rabbis are outside, whatever that means, and the women take the female convert and they basically put her in the water, and she's immersed in the water, and then the rabbis quickly come into the room, and she's tovelet bifnehem, and she's tovelet. You also have to remember, meaning a mikvah in the old days, the water was dirty, that it wasn't see-through, you know what I'm saying? And he describes how there was great sensitivity to modesty in our halachic tradition, and therefore to have rabbis going into the bathhouse was clearly highly inappropriate. And therefore he says, "Ukidei limtso heter yoter murvach, omer ani l'taken." And therefore he said, okay, we have to find a solution. So he said, "She'ta'amod hagioret b'levayot shalosh nashim Yisraeliyot lifnei Beit Hadin. Beit Hadin yodiu la mitzvot kalot v'chamorot." So basically, he's describing that the rabbis and three other women would accompany the convert almost to like the entrance to the bathhouse, like to the park. I don't know exactly what it was, and they would do the whole process, and they would inform her of the mitzvot and ask her if she accepts upon herself to perform the mitzvot, and the whole ritual. And then achrei kabbalata, after she accepts it, and then what happens? The rabbis leave, or they stay there, and the three women they accompany the woman into the bathing area, and then she's tovelet there, and then they report back to the rabbis, and that's valid. And for those who are involved in the topic of giur, you should realize it's not so simple. We assume that the basic components of conversion, certainly the immersion in the mikvah, has to be in the presence of a Beit Din. And here the dayanim are outside of the complex, and Rav Uziel permits the woman to immerse not in their presence. He wasn't the only one, I should just note. Meaning this was the practice of Rav Salant in Jerusalem, who was an Ashkenazic sort of Haredi rabbi. He ruled this way. In England, this was the practice, and even Rav Moshe Feinstein talks about it, I'm saying, as if, he was aware that different areas of the world had this custom. When Rav Ovadia Yosef came to Egypt, this was the custom apparently, and he was very, very upset with it. And he writes, I'm just going to read a little bit. He says, he already blames like modernity on this thing. He says, even though there are a lot of modern people that objected to this, and they said it's inappropriate for the dayanim to supervise. By the way, I don't think in Egypt there was a public bathing area. I think in general the practice was that the dayanim didn't go into the mikvah. They stayed outside. And he says this is not acceptable. He says this is hefech toratenu hakdosha, meaning this is the opposite of what our Torah wants. And he says, finally, there was like an appointed rabbinic figure, and he had to convince him. And he said he finally succeeded in convincing the rabbinic establishment in Egypt to do the tevilah, what he viewed as in the proper way. And he adds that, already conversion in the 20th century is somewhat questionable because there's so many intermarriages. And he says, he's fine with it. He's like, okay, we do tons of conversions, but that we should be lenient on the immersion as well. He says, He's not happy with that. I should just show you the following source. Rav Ovadia Yosef apparently kept a diary. That's fascinating, by the way. He kept a diary, and Rav Benny Lau of Jerusalem, I don't know how he got a copy of it, but he shared it with, or he published a note from the diary, and he writes, "B'chavhei b'cheshvan, nichnesu l'nasiya kilat zirei datim," and he describes when Rav Ovadia Yosef, or Rav Ovadia Yosef describes when he quit, when he resigned from the rabbinate in Egypt. And he gives the names. Aaron Shweka, he was one of the people who brought him to Egypt. And he says why, and by the way, Rav Ovadia Yosef basically resigned, and he thought the community would beg him to, stay, and in the end, they didn't really want him to stay. And he lists the reasons why he resigned, and one of them was Inyan Hagioret She'anu Nichnasim L'Tvila. I mean, that issue was of such tension between him and the community that he just couldn't take it anymore. As I mentioned, shchita and kashrut were also issues, but that was just one of the issues. When Rav Ovadia Yosef came to Israel, and he was more involved in the rabbinate in Israel, so the practice nowadays in Israel and in Batei Din around the world generally is that the woman immerses in a loose-fitting robe. That's the custom in Israel, I believe, in America and in most Batei Din. And he instituted that. And he writes a long tshuva why he believes that the robe is not considered a chatzitza and why it's appropriate. Okay, so there's one example. I'd like to continue. Rav Ovadia Yosef is possibly most well known for being Sephardic. I mean, what do you mean by for being Sephardic? He wasn't just chief Sephardic rabbi, but he sort of waged what you might call Sephardic battles, and one of them was what you might call like external, and one was internal. What do I mean by external? External had to do with the Ashkenazic world. Now, this battle was on like many different fronts. Some of it became political much later, in his career, but one of them had to do with halakha. But there was definitely a feeling he had as a young rabbi in the state of Israel, certainly post-Holocaust, that the Ashkenazic rabbis were not only the majority, but they were dominant, and they were suppressing Sephardic tradition. And he pushed back. And I want to give you one example of that came up. There was a movement in the beginning of the state of Israel to have what we call Ichud Minhagim. And the sense was as follows. It's one thing to live in Brooklyn or Vancouver, and we have our Ashkenazic synagogue and our Sephardic, but we all live in the state of Israel, and there's Baruch Hashem a kibbutz galiyot, an incoming of exiles. So why are we keeping separate customs? That was the feeling of some, and Rav Kook actually was one of the earlier ones to deal with this issue. And I have here a letter from Rav Kook, Taf Reish Ein Gimel. So we're talking about 1913, I believe. Okay, so it's pretty early. And let me just read a bit of it. And he writes, Al tipol beruchacha chabibi. He didn't mean chabibi the way modern people use the word chabibi. Im al pi hamasoret yu kibbutzenu sheba'u miglilot. I covered my screen, I can't see. V'shechayei hadat nitpatchu etzlam b'tzorot shonot. He says that each sect is not really the word, but each community should adhere to their traditions. And he's addressing the person who asked him the question. You're thinking, but what about national unity? He says, "Shtei teshuvot b'davar," two answers. He says, he says, Rav Kook says, first of all, the fact that we have different customs and different halachic rulings, it doesn't mean that it doesn't violate or undermine our chava, our brotherhood. As long as each community respects the other one. He says, more than that. He says, he says, more than that. He said, the more customs and the more traditions, the more, like the orchestra example, right? The more beautiful Klal Yisrael is. Shemitkabetz b'tzura harmonit b'chlalut ha'umah. And Rav Kook continues this sort of orchestra I guess one could say mashal, and he very much believes that people should stick to their traditions. There's a famous tshuva where Rav Kook talks about changing the mivtah. Now we know that in the state of Israel, generally speaking, the Sephardic way of pronouncing Hebrew is a dominant way of pronouncing Hebrew, and even for tefillot. And Rav Kook was against that. He felt that Ashkenazim should keep, praying in their original way of pronouncing the Hebrew words. Very, very interesting. Anyway, and he writes at the end, and he says that the division, anyway, whatever, the point is that he's very for maintaining customs. And this continued to be an issue among the early chief rabbis. For example, I mentioned Rav Uziel before, and Rav Uziel very much believed that we should find a way to do what's called ichud. Ichud meant like a unity of customs. Now, where are customs? Where is there conflict in customs? You know what I'm saying? Like what's the big deal? Like, where do we feel so different from each other? The truth is there are two areas I guess one could point to. One area is in the laws of kashrut and shchita, even though we don't see it nowadays, but there's certain laws of shchita that in certain times are very different. And tefillot and prayers, you know what I'm saying, where the nosach is different. And Rav Uziel felt that we should combine. Now you should know from Rav Uziel's perspective, often what that meant was compromising the Ashkenazic position. The Sephardic position. But he writes, Al kol panim, mikol hamor midubar mitbarer hadin be'er tev, shekol chilukei minhagim b'tfilot, all the different customs in prayer and the mitzvot and things like that, that are in public, b'fumbi b'veit ha'knesset, bichlal azharot delav delo titkodedu. We know there's a prohibition, halachic prohibition of lo titkodedu, lo tasu agudot. Don't have different customs. The Talmud says, don't have like different batei din in the same city that follow different rules. He says it looks like that. It looks like they're different religions. The Sephardic religion, why do we have to look so different? And therefore he objected to it. And he thought that really we should begin a process of unifying the customs. And one of the rabbis who pushed back against that, I'll just mention one more thing, by the way. Rav Goren, when he was the chief rabbi of the army, he published a siddur called Nusach Achid. You know what I'm saying? Because he figured everybody should pray, should daven the same Nusach. And it really looks like Nusach Sfarad, to be honest, meaning because Nusach Sfarad is sort of like a combination of Ashkenaz and Edot Mizrach, but it didn't catch on. But Ovadia Yosef pushed back, and he describes in Yabia Omer, those are his Teshuvot, Mashe Katvu Chaverai Nusieh Rabbanut Harishit L'Yisrael B'Haskamatam Hanal Mishum Darkei Shalom. And he says that which some of the presidents and the rabbis of the Rabbanut said, that Mishum Darkei Shalom V'Achdut, because of the unity in the Jewish people. Shelo Tieh HaTorah Kishtei Torot, so the Torah shouldn't look like there are two different Torahs, that we should merge and unify the halacha. And he gives examples. You should know, by the way, we're familiar with the laws of Yibum and Chalitza. In the Sephardic world, they were still doing Yibum in many communities. In the Ashkenazic world, since the Middle Ages, they didn't really do Yibum. And Ovadia Yosef fought that they should still do Yibum in the state of Israel. He thought that was a proper thing, and he was frustrated that he was overruled. And he mentions Mitzvah Yibum and Shchita, V'Treifot, and Shabbat, and Tarat Mishpacha. He says, Kol Kila Noheget Kiminhag Rabotehem, meaning, and every community should follow their own teachers, and the Sephardim should follow the Shulchan Aruch, which we'll get to in a minute, and the Ashkenazim should follow the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserlis, V'chein Noagim, and we have different prayers. And he says that's great, meaning that's the way it's supposed to be. That's always been the Jewish tradition. And then he quotes Rav Kook that we just read before, etc. And he quotes here, Hitzia Harishon Letzion, and he quotes Rav Uziel. He says, Mitoch Rov Ahavato, and he compliments him because he loves the Jewish people so much, and the unity of the Jewish people. And he wanted to take down the mechitzot that divide the Jewish people. But he said, I still disagree with him. And he quotes Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, who was the chief rabbi of Jerusalem at the time, who was also one of the teachers of Rav Ovadia Yosef, opposed this. Look what Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank said. He said, if the rabbis will agree that they'll sort of give up the Sephardic shchita, and the only shchita should be the Ashkenazi shchita for the sake of unity, he said, Akum, Ani, Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, the Ashkenazi rabbi, said, I'll get up and I'll open a Sephardic butcher because I believe that people should keep their own customs. Anyway, just giving you an example of this idea. Now, not only did Rav Ovadia Yosef sort of wage this battle in terms of the, he didn't want sort of Ashkenazic tradition to be lost, I guess one could say, to be swallowed up by a dominant Ashkenazic tradition, but he went much further than that. And I want to give a few examples. Here he writes about converts. He says, what happens if a person converts? It's a very interesting question. Like, when you convert, are you Ashkenazic or Sephardic? Or what are you? You know what I'm saying? Or as we would say, do you eat kitniot or do you not eat kitniot? I'm saying, what are you when you convert? And Rav Ovadia Yosef writes that it's clear to him the Ger Tzedek Shnitgayer be'Eretz Yisrael Kedat, meaning if you convert in Israel, even if you're from Poland, you know what I'm saying, what should you do? So he writes, he says, in Israel, we're all Sephardic. And that's a theme that we'll talk about in a few minutes. He says, Mi'ataho umaran ha'shulchan aruch umar da'atra de Eretz Yisrael. We'll come back to this. But Rav Ovadia Yosef fundamentally believed that first of all, Sephardim, he felt, had a longer tradition in the land of Israel, and they accepted the ruling of Rav Yosef Karo of the Shulchan Aruch, and therefore any Ashkenazim who moved to Israel sort of assimilate into the Sephardic majority. And there's a precedent for that, because the truth is that Rav Yosef Karo himself has a tshuva about this. This was a big issue in the Middle Ages. It's a fascinating issue because late Middle Ages, earliest or modern period, when there were exiles, when, after the expulsion from Spain in 1492, what happens to Sephardim or Ashkenazim, when they're exiled and they show up to a new community? Do they retain their previous customs? Do they accept the customs of the community that they're exiled to? You know what I'm saying? What happens? So Rav Yosef Karo ruled, again, we're talking about the 15th century, that basically the Ashkenazic exiles, they should integrate or assimilate into the Sephardic community. And Rav Ovadia Yosef really believed that that's what should happen to Israel, that the state of, or the land of Israel is basically, it's the Beit Knesset of Rav Yosef Karo. It's his community. And the Sephardic community is the community, anybody who moves to Israel fundamentally should be following that ruling. And the truth is that deep down, and Rav Ovadia Yosef said this in a few places, it's not clear how seriously he meant it, but he really deep down felt that even the Ashkenazic community, little by little, basically becomes Sephardic. You know what I'm saying? He felt that that's what the state of Israel was. But certainly if a person converts in the state of Israel and they don't have a prior tradition, of course they're Sephardic. And he writes, Umeata, ho'il umar na shulchan aruch umar de atra Yisrael. Rav Yosef Karo is like the rabbi of Israel. We accept Rav Yosef Karo, whether he's strict or whether he's lenient. To be honest, usually he's lenient. But there are many stringencies, but one of the major ones, for example, which Rav Ovadia Yosef pushed very strongly, was the eating of halak, of glad kosher meat. Ashkenazic custom in most of Europe. I know that it doesn't sound that way, because I know in North America now, like, everyone's eating glad kosher, but the classic Ashkenazic custom was not to observe halak or glad, but Sephardic custom, based on the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch, was to be very strict. He felt that Sephardim should be very strict. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. It's like being born in Israel, and you have to a convert, and therefore you have to accept the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch. That's what he felt. Even if you came from Poland, doesn't matter where you come from, etc. Now, I mentioned that Rav Ovadia Yosef was sort of waging I don't want to say war, it sounds a little aggressive, but different fronts, meaning one front was the issue of Sephardim in contrast to Ashkenazic halacha. He basically wanted to make sure that, first of all, Sephardic tradition was properly treated and respected. But beyond that, as I just described, he really felt that in the state of Israel or the land of Israel, it should be the dominant halachic tradition. But Rav Ovadia Yosef had sort of another domestic Sephardic battle he was fighting. And so I'm going to take another sip of coffee before it gets too cold. And Rav Ovadia Yosef, often I don't have to tell this group, but often I have to tell Ashkenazim that often people relate to the Sephardic world in a very simplistic way. Sephardim do X, as if like the Sephardic world, stretching from, I don't know, from Spain to Baghdad is like one, like homogeneous group. And the truth is that obviously there are different cultures and different countries, and Morocco and Tunis, and they had different customs and different halachic traditions. And there were communities within the Sephardic world that had different practices than the Shulchan Aruch, whether it be in Morocco and other places. I'll just give you an example. Like if you read the readings of Rav Massas, who came from Morocco, he says very straightforward. He says, we didn't always follow Rav Yosef Karo. This narrative that Sephardim always follow Rav Yosef Karo, he says wasn't true in Morocco. And he says that in Morocco and other areas, we didn't eat glatt kosher meat. We didn't eat halak meat. And sometimes we followed the rulings of the Ramav or Moshe Isserlis. And the real thorn, I guess one could say, for Rav Ovadia Yosef was the Ben Ish Chai. Because the Ben Ish Chai was probably like the most popular halachic sefer in the Sephardic world. It was sort of this parallel to like the Mishnah Brura, one could say, or the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch in the Ashkenazic world. And a lot of the practices that are mentioned there are, they're not, I don't want to say they're not classic Sephardic. Of course they're Sephardic. But from an outsider or from Rav Ovadia Yosef's perspective, they don't look Sephardic. They look a little bit Ashkenazic. And he fought very, very hard against the influence of the Ben Ish Chai. And let me give a couple of examples. First of all, in Rav Ovadia Yosef's introduction to the book called Halichot Olam, which I mentioned. By the way, I feel like I'm talking a lot, so feel free to throw questions out or anything. In the introduction to the Halichot Olam, which was his sort of commentary or critique of the Ben Ish Chai, he writes as follows, and he didn't actually write this until much later in his life. And he writes Kodem Misirat HaShiur, and he's relating to one of Rav Ovadia Yosef's first jobs, in the 30s, was that he gave a shiur in a Sephardic, congregation in Ben Ish Chai. He says, Kodem Misirat HaShiur, Hayiti Ma'amik Cheker B'chol Halacha V'Halacha, V'dat Eich L'nehog Halacha L'maseh, U'Lehorot Et Beit Yisrael. Ra'o Ra'iti V'Sefer Ben Ish Chai Kama Makama Halachot Neged Maran HaShulchan Aruch. He said, I would give my shiur and I would investigate. I'd look into each halacha, and I saw that the Ben Ish Chai often ruled against Rav Yosef Karo. Hein mishum she ha Ben Ish Chai chasda'in malya hein mishum, meaning either because hein mishum shekein iskim midato harachava. It could be that the Ben Ish Chai just, that was his opinion, etc. Ulam ledatenu divrei Maran HaShulchan Aruch nechonim yoter. He said, but we disagree with that. I don't know who he is, but he says we disagree with that. The rulings of Rav Yosef Karo in the Shulchan Aruch are truer and more authoritative. We, the Sephardic community, accepted to follow the Shulchan Aruch, whether it's strict or whether it's lenient. He's the rabbi of Israel. You know what I'm saying? We accept him. Mibnei Bavel is what Rav Ovadia Yosef would call the Iraqi communities. He said, Mitra Amim Alai. Richard, you wanted controversy, right? Meaning they were upset at me. Mitra Amim Alai. Shani posek neged Ben Ish Chai. I got in trouble because I rule against the Ben Ish Chai. Hechazik biadi mori hagon. My teacher of Ezra Atiyah, he was the Rosh Yeshiva Porat Yosef. V'odedoti lamshich laharot. And my rabbis encouraged me. I was only, I was a teenager, to keep ruling as I thought was correct, in accordance with Rav Yosef Karo. And I want to give you, there's so many examples, but I want to give you one example. The issue of mitzvot aseh shezman grama. We know that there's a machloket rishonim whether mitzvot aseh shezman grama, time-bound mitzvot that women are exempt from, which there are very few, which I'm saying we're talking about basically lulav and shofar, there aren't that many, whether women should say a bracha before saying them. The machloket rishonim, and the Rambam says no, and Rabbeinu Tam, reflecting Ashkenazic tradition, says yes. And in the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo says no, and the Rama says yes. Now, what really happened in the Sephardic world is a little bit more complicated, meaning in certain Sephardic communities, women did say brachot, meaning the Ben Ish Chai ruled that way, and in Iraq, in certain communities, women were saying brachot on the lulav. And Rav Ovadia Yosef was very upset about that. And he writes, Amnam lifnei zman, ma hitchilu k'tzat nashim Sfaradiot be'eretz Yisrael levarech al lulav. He says, a little while ago, some Sephardic women in the land of Israel began saying a bracha on the lulav. Bir otam ru'utehem u'shechinotehem yotzei artzot Ashkenaz. Their Ashkenazic friends they saw saying the bracha, and they started doing it as well. And Rav Ovadia Yosef was very, very against this, and he pushed back very strongly. I should just note, not only did he object to saying a bracha in mitzvot aseh shezman grama, he also objected, if I'm not mistaken, Rabbi, correct me if I'm mistaken, I think also Baruch She'amar and Yishtabach, and even, I forgot about Birkot Kriyat Shema, really pushed back against women saying these brachot. And part of the reason was this allegiance to Rav Yosef Karo, and to what he viewed as sort of like authentic Sephardic tradition. And I'll just write, he says, 30 years I've been talking publicly about this issue, to tell the women they shouldn't be saying the bracha. I try to explain to them very nicely. And Baruch Hashem, he says, women started listening to me, and they stopped saying the brachot. I should just note, for those who follow sort of developments in the Sephardic world, in recent years, there's a strong pushback against, I don't want to say against Rav Ovadia Yosef because he's no longer alive, but against that tradition. And there's a reawakening, one could say, of sort of, let's say the Northern African tradition. I'm not sure exactly the origins of, the members of this congregation that I'm speaking to, but, certainly those from Morocco are very much pushing back. In Israel currently, you had giant figures like Rav Masas and others who are no longer alive, but there's now a rabbinic organization of them, and they're pushing back and saying Rav Ovadia Yosef didn't necessarily speak for us. And we had other traditions, the ancient traditions, and our Sephardic communities, it's a very interesting development within the Sephardic world. Okay. I want to mention a few more rulings of Rav Ovadia Yosef. Richard wanted controversial ones or ones that made news. So I'll mention a few important ones that are both social and maybe slightly political. One of the things Rav Ovadia Yosef was possibly most well known for was his acceptance of the Ethiopian community. Just to refresh our memories, there's an ancient community of Jews in Ethiopia. And we have record of them, not from the 20th century, but literally from the Middle Ages, of this community that practices Judaism in Ethiopia. And they trace their lineage to Shevet Dan, from before the Churban Bayit Rishon. And the question arose in the state of Israel, well, what to do with them? Are they really Jewish? Should we bring them to Israel? Should we make them convert? Like, what do we do with them? And in 1973, here's the letter, Rav Ovadia Yosef issued a ruling where he basically ruled that they're Jewish. And because they're Jewish, we have to bring them to Israel. And he writes, Bistameich al Hagaon Haradbaz, and he quotes the Radbaz. The Radbaz lived in the 16th century, who already recorded the existence of this community. I'm not going to read the whole Teshuvot, it's already getting a little bit late. But he writes that they're Jewish. V'chein katvu kama gaonim degulim, and he quotes other, important rabbis who also rule that they're Jewish. Rav Hildesheimer from Germany, from Berlin, and Rav Kook he quotes, and others. Rav Herzog. Lachein bati, he writes, lemaskana sha palashim. Those are, the Ethiopian Jews. Heim tzetza'esh. Falashim, right. We used to call them falashim. The truth is, I remember in the 80s when they, made Aliyah, Mivtza Moshe. So that was a popular term. We don't use that anymore in the state of Israel, but the falashim, exactly. Heim tzetza'esh shivtei Yisrael. V'hidrimu lakush, and they ended up going south to eventually to Ethiopia. Ein kol safek, and he says there's no doubt that they're Jewish. And obviously, you should understand what that meant when Rav Ovadia Yosef, the chief Sephardic rabbi, not just the chief rabbi, he's Rav Ovadia Yosef. And maybe I should take a moment now to sort of describe, if I didn't do it sufficiently, one of the unique aspects of Rav Ovadia Yosef. Rav Ovadia Yosef was one in a millennia, meaning in terms of his knowledge, and it doesn't mean that one can't disagree with him or one can't disagree with his analysis, but you're dealing with a figure who first of all had a photographic memory. Thousands and thousands and thousands of volumes were word for word in his mind. It's a truly awesome phenomenon. And I'll just mention, and it frustrated him. In his Teshuvot, he often expresses frustration at Rav Moshe Feinstein, and he respected Rav Moshe Feinstein, and he quotes him as a colleague, one of the Gedolei Hador on the other side of the ocean, but he doesn't understand. Why doesn't Rav Moshe Feinstein use Achronim? Well, why doesn't he know all of these Sfarim that I know? Because Rav Moshe Feinstein, for those who are aware, intentionally had a somewhat limited scope of the use of Achronim, and Rav Ovadia Yosef was endless. And because of Rav Ovadia Yosef's weight, the state of Israel basically accepted his opinion. And 15 years later, I guess one could say at the end of the 1980s, you already had the operations to sort of bring the Falashim, as you said, the Ethiopian Jews to Israel under the Chok HaShavut. The issue of their conversion became much more complicated. I don't want to get into the issue of what, at first they did the Gior L'Chumra, and then they stopped doing it. But anyway, really a fascinating topic in the history of the state of Israel, and obviously reflects his rabbinic weight. I'll mention one or two more rulings here very quickly. One was, I don't want to call it political because he didn't view it as political. Nowadays, no one talks about anymore like land for peace. That was sort of like, that was the phrase we all used in the 70s and 80s and 90s. But there was an issue within the rabbinic world, like can you return or give land to the Palestinians in return for peace? And obviously the state of Israel did it with the state of Egypt, and they stated, but can you give land to the Palestinians? And many rabbis, certainly within the religious Zionist community, felt it was prohibited. I mean, the simple answer is that, all things being equal, one is not supposed to, give land to non-Jews, but what if it will bring peace? So Ovadia Yosef was very clear. He felt that, I'll read it. Meaning if the army and the government, they feel that giving, returning, whatever verb you want to use, land in exchange for peace will save lives, and that if you don't return land, that there's an immediate danger to the state of Israel, to the residents of people. He said, he says everybody would agree that it's permitted. That was the view of Rav Ovadia Yosef, and therefore later on in the political realm, the Shas party was perceived as a center-left party in the early days, and not less so now, but certainly the days of Rabin, for two reasons. First of all, they were more into social welfare benefits possibly than other parties, but also politically they supported or at least enabled the Oslo agreements to pass because fundamentally they subscribed to the halachic permissibility of land for peace. It's endless. We could do a whole semester in Ravad Yosef, you're saying, but maybe I'll mention one more. What's unique about Ravad Yosef possibly is that like it's hard to put him in a little box. Now it could be because that's the beauty, first of all, of Ravad Yosef, and maybe more of Sephardic rabbis, where a lot of the Ashkenazic rabbis, it's like are they Haredi, are they religious Zionist, or they, what I'm saying? Like everyone's like in a little box. And Ravad Yosef wasn't really in a box, meaning he clearly wasn't religious Zionist in the classic sense, what I'm saying, of what used to be the Mafdal in Israel. It definitely was not there at all, what I'm saying, and most of his hashkafic views and political views were very much Haredi in terms of the army and the learning in yeshivot, and he was very much in that world. On the other hand, he was a full participant in the state of Israel, fully embraced the state of Israel, they say that he said the tefillah for the chayalim in his minyan, they would open the Aron Kodesh and he would say tefillah, for the chayalim. So the issue of Hallel and Yom Ha'atzmaut obviously was a hot issue in Israel. And of course, it sort of went down what you might call like hashkafic lines, where the Haredi world certainly rejected it. The religious Zionist world embraced it. There was a technical question of saying a bracha, not saying a bracha, but they certainly embraced it. What was Rav Ovadia Yosef's position? And he writes, Rabim batzumim migdolei Yisrael ro'im b'akamat hamedinat chalta de geula. And he begins by saying, many of the great gedolim, Torah scholars viewed the establishment of the state as et chalta de geula, of the beginning of the redemption. And he quotes a beautiful Gemara, it's actually Yerushalmi, of these two rabbis, Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Shimon Chalaf, these two rabbis that they saw, it's almost like now in Israel, like they saw dawn, they saw the sun coming up, and little by little, and they saw the light. And Amalei, who says Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Shimon Chalafta, Kachi Gulatan Shal Yisrael, it's beautiful. He says, this is like the redemption of the Jewish people. B'tchilat kima kima, just like the sun comes up, a little bit. You see the light, right? Little bit, right? Komashi holechet, hirabava holechet, and then more and more and more. And he says that's the way, the rabbis viewed the establishment of the state of Israel. And he says that Rav Menachem Kasher, quotes a cruise, meaning in 1948. Remember, Ravad Yosef was still in Egypt, but the rabbis, a lot of the Gedolei Yisrael, put out sort of a statement embracing the establishment of the state of Israel, and they call it et chalta de geula. Now, within time, a lot of these rabbis pulled back in terms of their Zionism, but in 1948, he's just, that's his introduction, and he says, but you know what? He says, we're not there yet, and he says, we're just not there. He says, we're in a very difficult time. He says it's not so safe here in Israel. He says we have a lot of wars, we have a lot of hostile neighbors. We're still not at peace with them. And he talks about here. I'm going to keep going. He talks about also on the spiritual front. He says, listen, it's not so simple. Like the majority of the country is what what they used to call secular, and the spiritual level of the Jewish people in Israel in terms of modesty, and he even says pornography and movies and chil Shabbat and non-kosher restaurants. He says b'meimadim mavhilim. It's scary, the percentages. So he says to believe that we've hit the redemption. He says that's also we have to be very careful. But he does write in the next paragraph. He says. First of all, he says, did we wait 2,000 years for a Jewish state with non-kosher butchers and pornography and immodesty and chil Shabbat? But then he says, for that reason, so I'm just looking, there was a line here I wanted to show you. I just have to find the line. I'll get to it in a second. He says, "Umisibot elu harbe mishlomei emonei Yisrael asher roim shadayin shechinta begalut noagim shelo lomar hala bechlal b'yom ha'atzmaut." He says, for that reason, a lot of the big rabbis don't say Hallel. Because even if they acknowledge that the state is special and unique, he says, we're not there yet. But he says, he concludes, he says, I'm not going to deny, he says, that yeshnam orot gedolim she'ein lanu l'talem mehem. On the other hand, he says we can't ignore the great renewal, he says, of the Torah world and yeshivot and the tens of thousands of people learning Torah in the state of Israel. And therefore, basically says that the state of Israel is a very complicated place. And therefore, Hallel with a bracha is something that he's not willing to embrace. But again, for our purposes, the issue of saying with a bracha or not a bracha is less important. I wanted to highlight his overall attitude towards the state of Israel. Again, we could go on for hours and days and semesters, but I think we've given a little bit, maybe I'll summarize in a sentence or two, a taste of Rav Ovadia Yosef. What I wanted to sort of highlight were, by the way, one of the things I didn't mention was something that Rav Ovadia Yosef mentioned very often, that he fundamentally is subscribed to what we call koach dehetera adif, meaning he viewed it's his responsibility to view leniently and not to make the Torah a burdensome for the Jewish people. But aside from that, we spoke about his defense of the Sephardic tradition, both in terms of, in contrast to the Ashkenazic world, and also domestically within the Sephardic world, the dominance, what he called, of the ruling of Rav Yosef Karo, the Shulchan Aruch, and also, as I mentioned, very important rulings that are significant for the state of Israel, whether it be regarding land for peace or the Ethiopians and things like that. I think with that, we're going to wrap it up. I was told to leave like 10 minutes for questions. I left much less than that. I apologize. But if anyone has any thoughts, I'm going to stop the share so I can see more people. If anyone has any thoughts or comments or questions, please.
I have a question.
Please.
So first of all, thank you. It's really difficult to cover such a great personality in an hour or so. It's impossible.
It's impossible.
You touched on a few things, but first of all, Rabbi Benny Lau, you mentioned, was with me in Golani in the same unit for a couple of years. But something that always bothered me with Rabbi Ovadia Yosef Zichrono Livracha is in his last 20 years, it was almost impossible to wake up on Sunday morning and not read the headlines or some news of his drasha on Motzai Shabbat, which he tended to have supposedly controversial and very weird statement that always been taken out of context, which attracted a lot of heat from the people who really didn't understand what he was saying. Yet
100%.
he kept doing that. And I think, to me, I always knew, even if I did not understand his statement, that there's something in it, and I'm katonti milehavin. But in the eyes of the media and the news that he tend to make those Sundays after the Motzai Shabbat Rasha was really mind-boggling because he kept doing that. Can you speak to that?
I'll tell you, you're 100% right. Meaning, and I was in Israel during all those years where he would do that. I'll tell you the way I deal with it, because you're 100% right. It's very difficult for us as students of the Torah to hear our rabbi speaking in a way that was very, what you might call gas, and calling people names, and it could be that, a high percentage of the people that he criticized, maybe we agree with what he said, maybe not, but the language he used, meaning if Rabbi Gabbai would use that language, they might demand your resignation. I don't know. You know what I'm saying?
Me out.
And more than that, I would say that you would educate your congregants and your rabbinic peers. We don't talk that way nowadays in the 21st century, or who talk. So I don't have a good answer, meaning it was his personality, but I will say as follows. I'll say that it's important to look at the totality of a person's personality. Rav Ovadia Yosef, you're dealing with a person who didn't go to sleep at night before he would write a tshuva permitting an aguna. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, that's the personality you're talking about. So the way I always viewed it was like at a certain point, I have to give him a little bit of credit. You know what I'm saying? Meaning like I'm willing to overlook some statements that like it's hard for me to come to terms with. I agree with you 100%, but like in the totality of his personality and his contribution to the Jewish people, not just as a Torah scholar. There are a lot of Torah scholars that have written chidushim, and no, I mean his contribution in terms of his love for the Jewish people and going out on a limb for the Jewish people. I always viewed myself as like willing to sort of overlook those statements, even though it's not so simple. Do you know what I'm saying? There are people who are very hurt by them. But, that was my attitude. Where unfortunately, there are rabbis who don't have the resume that Rav Ovadia Yosef has. And they don't have a history of being matir agunot and whatever. And therefore, I'm maybe less generous in terms of my view towards them. So I don't really have a good answer, meaning it was part of his personality. You know what I'm saying? I don't really, it's difficult. But I personally, because of the totality of his both Torah giantness and his kindness, I felt that I was able to overlook it. I don't know if that helps at all, but that was my view.
A little bit. I think one of his greatest attributes and contribution to the Jewish people was that he always find a way to say yes. Meaning,
right.
In halakha, the easiest thing to say is no, can't do that. But he always find a way to say yes, which is
it's more than that, meaning it's not
challenging.
That he viewed it as his rabbinic responsibility. Just saying, my job is to solve problems. He has and maybe with this I'll end, he has a very important speech that he gave to the Knesset regarding conversion. And it's very, very important. It's very interesting. It describes his relationship and his work for conversion over the years. And he has a line there, which has really stuck with me. And he says, Ani poter ba'ayot. That's what he told the Knesset. He says, I solve problems. That's the way he viewed himself, meaning that's his responsibility. If you want to be a posek, then your job is to solve problems. It doesn't mean you can't say no. That's also legitimate. But fundamentally, ani poter ba'ayot. And I'm not sure whether everyone, had the same outlook. And again, for that and many other reasons, again, he didn't call me any names, so I didn't have to overlook it. But anyway, okay. Maybe if there's another question, and then we'll wrap it up. Yeah, please.
Okay. No, it's another question. Following what was just being said, maybe that's the reason why they said the Falashas, the Ethiopian Jews, were Jews, because that's what 1973. Genetic science was not was just starting, because they have been studies. They have done genetic studies on the people who came from Ethiopia, and they have found there's no Jewish DNA whatsoever on the Ethiopian Jews. So
I'll put this way, I think there's a broader question which one would have to investigate, which is what was Rav Ovadia Yosef's attitude towards scientific development. And we know that, nowadays it's a big issue within the rabbinic courts. Do we use DNA tests? Do we not? So you'd have to really fully investigate, or Rav Ovadia Yosef might tell you, I just don't care, meaning halakha doesn't work that way. Yeah. So you're asking a very interesting question.
Yes, because that's what I'm saying. So halachic, he made the decision they're Jews, but I wonder if it was not, if it were now, where genetic research has developed so much, whether he would have end up in the same same conclusion.
It's a good question.
Yes, but if what we're talking about is that he wants to solve problems, and I can see, if people say, they're Jewish and they want to contribute to the Jewish nation, to the Jewish people, great. We need more people. We need more power in numbers and in doing mitzvot. So I can see that, but I don't know, because we had another rabbi a few weeks ago talk on zoology, on animals, And one of the rabbis, went through all the trouble of getting an animal on to see, where the teeth, where it was, to make a decision whether the animal was kosher or not. So they're doing really precise work in trying to make a decision later on halacha, So, but maybe the reason he said the Ethiopian Jews are Jews because they want to be Jews, and they're following some things, and it's irrelevant whether they are genetically Jews or not. May have be that reason, because there are some people. There are two tribes in South Africa. I think one of them is Lemba, it's called, that they have found the model haplotype of the haplotype of the Kohanim in the man. They are present in the man in these particular tribes. So, which is the same as any Kohanim in anywhere in the world. They have that same mark.
Interesting.
And they haven't found that in the Ethiopian Jews.
Interesting.
But
I don't know. Again, you'd have to really. It's a much deeper question regarding his attitude towards science as opposed to halachic methodology.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's an excellent question.
Mm-hmm.
Any final questions? I actually have to run to work in a minute. So if there,
I think it's getting late. I think you've. I just want to first of all say thank you for the incredible taste, if you want, of you managed to encapsulate, like Shlomo said before, in an hour. A little over an hour, about a giant of a man, someone who we all relate to today. And very often, I think, Shlomo, to your point, just to say that, first of all, people often relate to Ovadia as a politician. And as the rabbi mentioned, it's you have to see the bigger picture. You have to see who he was as a man, who he was as his compassion, his passion, his zealousness, his incredible contribution to Klal Yisrael at large. I think it does give it a completely different dimension. I just point out one other point with regards to what you mentioned with the koach de hetera. There's this unique level of being able to say, it's okay, as opposed to say it's asur. Ovadia in his Sefer in Tarat HaBayit actually writes in a place that is part of the philosophy of Sephardic Jewry. Sephardic Rabbanim philosophy is koach de hetera. So that's it kind of all tied in together.
He fundamentally, it wraps into what I spoke about much earlier. He fundamentally, exactly what you're saying, believed that was a characteristic of Sephardic psikat halacha.
Right.
You're 100% right.
In the world of Rabbanut, as well as the underlying thing. Yeah. So anyway, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your time. We appreciate that you woke up early to give this to us. We really enjoyed it, and you've given really an incredible overview of such a giant. Thank you so much.
It was great being here. Nice meeting everyone. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
תודה רבה.